We are in Matthew chapter 26 today. Matthew 26, starting in verse 16. It's on page 942 of your Pew Bible, if you'd like to join us in that. Matthew 26, 16 to 19, page 942. God's Word gives us hope. And this is what it says, starting in verse 16. And from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man, and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover." God's word goes out from his mouth. It will not return to him empty, but will accomplish what he desires and will achieve the purpose for which he sent it. Please be seated. I haven't said this yet today. I've alluded to it, but I am thankful to be back here. Last week, with being sick and being out, it just wasn't it hasn't been a fun week at all. But it also just feels wrong not being here on a Sunday morning. You know, when you come here on Sunday, it feels like a Sunday being here in church, and then it just sets up for the rest of your week. So the whole week just kind of felt off not being here. So I'm just grateful to be back here this morning with you, and grateful that for the deacons who covered for me while I was gone. And I haven't thanked for a while the people who do music or who are back running sound and live stream and lyrics. I mean, there's just a whole lot of people serving and doing things here at the church, and just grateful for you all. It's been such a blessing serving here at First Baptist. But I want to share with you a story about a man. There was once a man named George, whose job was to sweep and clean out the shavings underneath the huge lathes and machinery that were running at the machine shop that he worked at. And George was a believer, and he loved the teaching of scriptures on the end times. He would sing hymns as he worked. Many of them had to do with the second coming of Christ, such as "What a Day That Will Be" and "The King is Coming," which is why, not coincidentally, we sang those hymns today. But late one Friday night, about 10 minutes to quitting time, when the rest of the workers were getting ready to leave and go home, one of the workers looked at George, and he said, "George, are you ready?" He said, "Yep." But he was all dirty. He was just obviously not ready. In fact, he looked like he was ready to keep on working. And so the worker said, "Aren't you ready to go home?" And George said, "Yeah, I'm ready." The worker said, "But look at you. Man, you're not ready. You got to go clean up." George smiled. "No," he said, "let me show you something." And so he unzipped his coveralls, and underneath were the neatest, cleanest clothes you could imagine. He had them all ready. All he had to do when the whistle blew was to unzip and step out of those coveralls, walk up and punch out his clock, and he was gone. He said, "You see, I stay ready to keep from getting ready, just like I'm ready for Jesus." See, George lived with the end in mind. He lived by looking forward to Jesus' return. Now, why would I talk about that story with the passage we just read? And why would I talk about that on a Sunday that we're going to observe communion? After all, we normally speak about communion as a time of remembrance, as it should be. I mean, Jesus, when he was instituting the ordinance of communion, which is also known as the Lord's Supper, literally told his disciples twice to do this in remembrance of me. We are to partake of communion in remembrance of the sacrifice that Jesus paid on our behalf. See, Jesus took our sin on himself. He took everything that separated us from God, and he bore it on the cross, and he died in our place. And 3 days later, he rose again. We must believe in him and what he did to be saved. That is the gospel. And communion constantly brings the gospel to mind. Communion is first and foremost about remembering what Christ did. But there's another aspect to communion that we need to be aware of. It comes in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. In that letter, he details the practice of communion and gives instructions on how believers are to partake of it. And after he quotes what Jesus said on the night that he was betrayed, Paul shares an important statement that we need to take notice of. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26, it says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Does that sound familiar? Hopefully it should, because I share it every time that we have communion. And there's 4 parts to this verse. The first 3 we should know pretty well. We know that we need to eat the bread during communion. That represents Jesus' body, which was given for us. We know that we need to drink the cup during communion. That represents Jesus' blood, which was shed for us, and is the new covenant of grace he offers us. And we also know that communion proclaims the Lord's death, because that is what we have gathered to remember. We get, I think, all 3 of these things. But it's that last part that we need to take notice of. We do this, Paul says, until he comes. You proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. You see, inherent in our observation of communion is not just a time of remembering, but it is an expression of hope and trust that Christ will one day come again. Communion reminds us that Jesus will one day return. That's our first point for today. Communion reminds us that Jesus will one day return. He will come back to get us. He will bring all believers, both those in the grave and those still living, he will be bringing them to be with him in paradise. He will come back and make all things right. The righteous will be saved, the wicked will perish. Communion reminds us that Jesus will one day return. And leading up to the Last Supper, Jesus demonstrated why this is important for us to focus on. I want us to look back at our passage again for today. Matthew 26, I'm going to read it all. Matthew 26, 16 to 19. Again, it says this, "And from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him." That's talking about Judas. From that moment, Judas sought an opportunity to betray him. "Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, 'Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?' He said, 'Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover." See, the final day was upon him. The final few hours, in fact. Jesus would soon be crucified, but the disciples didn't know that. All they knew was that the Passover had arrived, and to follow Jewish law and custom, they should observe it. Now, Judas Iscariot has just struck a deal with the Jewish leaders to betray Jesus, and we see in verse 16 that he began looking for opportunities to do so. So in other words, the time is short. And Jesus, though, doesn't try to escape, nor does he try to confront Judas. He knows that this was a part of God's will. He knew that he had to go through this gruesome death to secure our salvation. And instead of trying to avoid the valley of the shadow of death, Jesus sought instead to prepare his disciples for it. And to prepare them, he demonstrated his omniscience. He showed that he was all-knowing. He told his disciples in verse 18 to go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them. See, Jesus gave guidance for his disciples, and so that they would know exactly what to do. During the Last Supper, he also gave them even more instructions. We're going to be looking at this eventually in the Gospel of John. Chapters 13 through 17 is all happening in the upper room as Jesus is with his disciples. He gives them instructions so that they would know what to do and why. He did it for them. He does it for us as well. He gives us guidance for the future. So communion reminds us that Jesus provides guidance for believers. And that's our second point for today. The communion reminds us that Jesus provides guidance for believers. See, when we approach the table and we partake of the bread and the cup, we are not only reminded of what Jesus did during his life, but also that he seeks to guide us in the present as well and into the future. See, we don't come to communion in a vacuum. We approach it wherever we are in life and with whatever situation that is weighing on our minds. Jesus doesn't want us to forget about what is going on in our lives or what we're going through. He wants us to submit it to him. He wants us to seek his direction. And he wants us to recognize that he has power and authority in that situation to help us through it. The disciples' request in this passage was a simple one, and Jesus gave them specific directions on what to do. He seeks to do the same for us. Communion reminds us that Jesus provides guidance for believers. But that's not the only thing that we should take away from this time together. 2 other Gospels describe the exact same event, and they give us more detail. Through them, I think we see that Jesus isn't only concerned about the present, but our future as well. In Mark 14, right after Judas began looking for opportunities to betray him, Jesus says this to the disciples in Mark 14:13-16. He says this, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. There prepare for us." And the disciples set out and went to the city and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. Now, isn't that amazing? Jesus just told them that exactly what would happen and exactly what to do. And not only that, but the disciples found it exactly as he described it. It wasn't that most of it was the same or that there was a detail or two that was different. No, Jesus had complete knowledge of what would happen in their immediate future, and he told it to them. Luke records a similar circumstance in Luke 22. Again, right after Judas accepts the money and begins to look for opportunities to betray Jesus, the disciples ask where they should prepare the Passover. This is what Luke records in Luke 22:10-13. He said to them, "Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and tell the master of the house, 'The teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there." And they went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. I mean, this is an almost verbatim retelling of what happened in Mark. If we put the 3 Gospels together, we see that Jesus not only had knowledge of exactly what would happen in the future, but he also shared it with his disciples. And so communion should remind us that Jesus knows exactly what will happen in the future. It's our third point for today. Communion reminds us that Jesus knows exactly what will happen in the future. He knows the specifics. He knows the who, what, where, when, and how. And do you know what the flip side of that should be then? If we know that Jesus knows everything, the flip side of that is the honest and humble admission that we don't. We have no clue what the future will bring. We like to pretend that we do. We plan for the future. We schedule for the future. We act today with the future in mind. But when it comes right down to it, we have no clue of what's going to happen. And so when we know that Jesus knows exactly what will happen in the future, then we should do at least 2 things. First, we should trust him. And secondly, we should abide in him, which means to stay close to him. And one way we can do that is through communion. You see, every time we partake in communion, we are repeating Jesus' promise to us. When he said that the bread represents his body, which is given for us, he had not yet given his body for us. When he said that the cup represented the new covenant given in his